we let companies get away with many things like this, to the end of like, oh well, such and such is not our responsibility. Our responsibility is to our shareholders. That kind of attitude has given us many social systemic inequities, of which the loss of privacy is only one. It's just totally absurd.
I'm Tor Bair from Enigma, and welcome to Decentralize This. Hello, and welcome to yet another episode of Decentralize This presented by Enigma. I'm Tor Bair, I'm the head of growth for Enigma, and today I'm hosting a very special guest, Alison Macrina, someone who's a bit different from some of the people that I've hosted previously. Alison works as the community team lead at the Tor Project. The Tor Project primarily maintains the Tor anonymity network, which allows users to browse the internet while preserving their privacy. Tor is decentralized by design, utilizing a principle called onion routing, and they have nodes all over the world. Alison's also the founder of the Library Freedom Project, which helps educate librarians about the importance of privacy and gives them resources to help organize and educate their communities. On this episode, Alison and I discuss how the Tor network protects its users, how preserving privacy is essential to human freedom, the relationship between decentralization and privacy, the dangers of growth at all costs, and also why she's skeptical of many of the people and projects in the blockchain space. This episode is one of my favorites, and it's really representative of the conversation that we're trying to have with Decentralize This. Decentralizing the world, building sustainable systems that work for real humans, these are really challenging tasks, and it's much more than just blockchain or cryptocurrency. I hope that Alison teaches you as much as she taught me in this conversation. So without any further introduction, here is Alison Macrina. Alison, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Decentralize This. I am honored to be able to talk with you.
I'm really happy to be here.
So we start every show the same way. Just take a second, professionally, personally. Who are you, Alison?
I am an activist working on making the internet safe for regular human beings. I work on the Tor Project, where I'm the community team lead, and I'm the director of the Library Freedom Project.
That's awesome. And a lot of our listeners probably have heard of the Tor Project. They might not be as familiar with the Library Freedom Project, but I imagine that a lot of them would have questions about what exactly all of these projects try to achieve, because sometimes it's in the news, sometimes it's getting coverage in mainstream media outlets where I feel like they don't do a great job portraying what Tor is actually trying to achieve. So let's start by maybe talking about the Tor Project. How does it work? Why does it work? What's it trying to achieve? Just let's give everybody like a crash course in Tor. Not me, of course. This is going to be super confusing for the next like whatever minutes, but let's try to focus.
Tor Project is an organization where we build technology for human rights. Our main piece of software, our flagship software, is called the Tor browser. It's a web browser that you can download for free. And when you use Tor browser, nobody can see the websites that you visit. Nobody knows where in the world you're really coming from. And so in that way, it protects you against both surveillance and censorship.
That's an awesome mission. And I know that a lot of people in our audience, if they're following our project, are definitely very concerned with issues of data privacy and personal privacy. Why is that important? Like, why do you personally believe that privacy is a human right?
Well, if you take away people's privacy, whether it's deliberate, if they're targeted by surveillance, or whether people feel that their privacy is violated, it's very hard to exercise other fundamental human rights. For example, people can't really have intellectual freedom or freedom of speech if they feel like they don't have any privacy, because the feeling of being watched is something that contributes to self-censorship. You're not going to read, write, research, speak freely if you feel like some adversary is paying attention to what you're doing. I think this is an especially important thing to fight for in our current era because we do everything online. The internet is there's no such thing as IRL and online. The internet is real life. We really never log off. And the way that the internet is right now, increasingly, is dominated by a handful of very powerful companies and also governments who work in conjunction with those companies. And data is a hot commodity. It's something that most internet companies use to get advertisers to pay for their products. And so the loss of privacy is very lucrative to some very powerful interests.
Yeah, some of what these larger organizations are doing, right? The argument that I keep hearing is, it wasn't like done to us. It was just, it was in pursuit of a business model, and that's capitalism, right? Like they didn't know that they were really potentially destroying the fabric of society by doing this. It was just, good business. I don't think that's a very convincing argument for people anymore. So what do you think? What do you think of these arguments when companies kind of say that like privacy is not their primary responsibility? Do you think that has like any grain of truth to it?
No, I think they're full of shit. I mean, I don't think I think that they know very well. First of all, the idea that they're just thinking about their bottom line and there are all these unintended consequences. I mean, that's not a good defense anyway, but I also just don't believe it. I also think that we let companies get away with many things like this, to the end of like, oh well, such and such is not our responsibility. Our responsibility is to our shareholders. That kind of attitude has given us many social systemic inequities, of which the loss of privacy is only one. And so, the idea that we let companies just do whatever we want with our data without any consequence, and we let them get away with saying, well, it's not our responsibility. It's just totally absurd.
So do you think part of the problem is just that data is so intangible, right? Like if somebody was coming to your house and they were taking all your stuff and they were walking out with your TV, I'm sure somebody would notice. But the fact that this is data, right? Something that we kind of passively create just by our existence. Do you think that makes it hard for people to grasp what's happening when that same data is being misused, exploited, or just, not being kept secure?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that part of what has created an environment where we think of data as like not having like a corporeality or whatever, it's not something tangible. Um, Internet companies have reinforced that idea by making their products behave in ways that encourage us to contribute our data to them, to make them work better, to make them more interesting. And I think most insidiously, to make ourselves more addicted to them. So I think people are only starting to come around to the idea that data does have a physical nature. I mean, not just that we should think about it the way that we think about physical objects, but also that it very much like data lives on servers, which are real places, which consume real energy, which are, contributing to climate change, which are really, data is really like the contents of our brain, et cetera, et cetera. I think that is becoming a more normal concept, but it's taken a long time for us to get there.
Let me ask you something, and maybe for us this is maybe a bit of a straw man, but I've certainly heard the argument, at least from some people, maybe they're in government and this is why I hear it, but why do you need privacy if you have nothing to hide? Right? Like that gets thrown around. Like I know that like maybe that's like maybe artificially reducing that side of the argument a little too much, but maybe just react to that kind of phrase.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, either those people are cops or they have no imagination, because it's you can so quickly, so swiftly dismantle that argument from anyone who actually believes it by asking them for their credit card numbers or for their social security number. Or if you want to be really bold, ask them why they're wearing clothes. I mean, the idea that people don't have that people have nothing to hide. Everybody has something to hide. And we make decisions about our privacy constantly. We choose to have curtains on our windows and we get to decide whether they're open or closed. We walk outside, put clothes on. We don't tell people our medical conditions or the contents of our bank accounts or whatever. I think that if people do actually believe that, I think what they're trying to say is, I'm not doing anything wrong, and so why should I care about, hiding certain things from, for example, law enforcement or whatever? And this, to me, comes from a position of privilege, considering that, there are many, many examples currently and historically of people who are not doing anything wrong, who come under the scrutiny of very powerful actors anyway. And also, sometimes people are doing things that are quote unquote wrong, but are determined to be wrong because they are upsetting to the status quo, So, civil disobedience, for example, is wrong because it's illegal. But like, who makes the decision about what's wrong and what's the goal of making something wrong? So it's just so much more complex to say, oh, I'm not, I have nothing to hide. Those people are telling you where they fit into society when they tell you that.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point around privilege. Just, we think about privacy, I think, a little differently than somebody in Saudi Arabia might. And I can't speak for the majority of our listening audience, but I assume most of them are in fairly privileged positions themselves. I think that only recently have these kind of privacy issues come to the forefront in the mainstream media anyways in the US, but these have been issues that I've been seeing people talk about for years, especially in, countries and parts of the world where there are much more oppressive governments. And it's like, well, why wasn't I reading about that? Well, you weren't reading about it because they have oppressive governments.
Right.
So now that people are paying attention in the US, I mean, what should they be thinking about? What should they be doing? Like, how do we stop people from thinking like, oh, this is a problem for other people and not me?
Something that needs to happen, and it's hard to tell exactly how this should go, because I think there could be a few different ways and it could turn out well. But I think the first thing is that we have to reckon with the role of technology in our lives and how much we have put trust in these private companies who are beholden to us in no way and are accountable to us in no way. And I'm talking about companies like Facebook, Google, Amazon, who, some of them, they're only the only like currency they trade in is data. Some of them, they do more than that. But we have, as a society, decided for whatever reasons that we trust these companies. We give them all this information about ourselves. And I'm not, let me be clear, I'm not putting the blame entirely on like people or users. But I think that it is true that we have to think about like, well, why have we trusted these companies so much? And they've repeatedly violated that trust. I mean, Facebook alone, think about how many scandals, ethical nightmares that Facebook has been involved in, and what kind of accountability have we seen from them? Almost nothing. So the first thing is that, we have to figure out like why we're so willing to give up all of our information to these companies that don't care about us. And then the next thing is figuring out a way to break up their monopolies. And so, that requires a set of political solutions that there's a lot of debate around. Like, we want regulation, but then at the same time, we don't want the government to have that data that has just come from the private companies. We should break these companies up so they're not so powerful, but since they're so big and so powerful, how do you even start to break them up? Like breaking Facebook into, for example, Instagram and Tinder and WhatsApp, like those are still enormously powerful companies on their own. So what do you even do? But I think that, at least having the starting point of recognizing that these are not our friends, and we have to have a kind of adversarial, oppositional attitude towards them that puts us, the people, in control of our data. I think if we start from there, we can get to a pretty good place.
And you're making a lot of great points, but I want to ask you what we would do. Let me give you a situation, because I have a lot of friends who still work in big tech, and I've worked in big tech, and I've been a data scientist in big tech. So I've seen some of how this data kind of gets misused and mishandled firsthand. What do you tell somebody who's working at Facebook right now who might have liked their job and is now kind of watching the world burn around them, in a sense, where now, maybe they joined a little bit after all of these systems were into their second decade of existence. And now they're having to reckon with this, the fact that people are now figuring out what's been happening to their data for all of these years. But they're just people at a company, and a company is really just made up of people. What should somebody who currently works at Facebook or Google or any of these other places, like, what can they do? I mean, beyond just quit, but what can they do maybe internally to be starting to help things? Do you think there's anything they can do?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I think is that I would never call them just people, because just people have, the power of just people is how we have any kind of power, and it starts with some individuals who decide that enough is enough, whatever that is for them. So I think that the first thing is to recognize that they actually do have a tremendous amount of power, even just being an employee in one of these companies and seeing that something is wrong. From there, I think, beyond just quitting, which is, can be powerful, but there may be some other things that I would suggest that they do first. One is, I think that something that we've seen that has been pretty tremendous in the last couple of years is tech workers at these companies standing up to the company, using the power that they have as workers in those companies to stand up to the company's policy on something. So we saw all the walkouts that happened at Google against, how many abusive men have been protected by the company for years. So that was a really amazing example of tech workers standing up to the power of their, company or whatever. We saw the same thing happen in a few different places, Microsoft, Google, standing up to their company's participation in, like military projects. So I think that is something that I would encourage tech workers to do, is to work together with other tech workers to campaign in some way publicly against the way that your company has behaved unethically. And another suggestion is, and this is definitely riskier, but is really, really needed. If they are witnessing, in particular, some injustice, help get it brought to light, blow the whistle on it, go tell a journalist about it. That's something that had, if not for amazing whistleblowers working in tech companies, working with this kind of data, we wouldn't know about, for example, the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal, if not for Christopher Wiley, who blew the whistle on that. So those are the two main things I would suggest. And if neither of those are possible for whatever reason, then yeah, you should quit, because if you're not doing anything, if you're working for those companies and you're just taking home a paycheck, I'm sorry to tell you, but you are complicit. And so if you're going to quit, though, you should publicly tell people why you're quitting.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful statement to make, right? Is leaving one of these companies, but it's only powerful if you can articulate why, and it's only powerful in your next actions, I suppose. And when I left big tech, I moved into this blockchain/decentralization space, hoping to find companies and people and projects that were at least aligned with my personal missions. And I'm fortunate enough to have found one. And I know a lot of people who have left those companies only to get sucked back into other large companies that are facing all the same issues, but maybe not reckoning with them on a global scale and getting dragged in front of Congress yet. I should say yet.
Well, then they can blow the whistle on those companies and hasten the
And they just
hasten
might.
what comes next.
And they
Yeah.
just might. Every time I refresh the news, I feel like, it could be literally any name, because this is just the nature of the internet's business model these days. Not the internet itself, but anybody who's built an application on top of it.
That's right.
And what I'm going to ask you is, is this a threat to any kind of centralized organization these days? Or like is this something inherent to centralization, where if you concentrate enough power, eventually it corrupts? Or is this something else that maybe was encouraged by the way that the internet is structured somehow? Like, is it more structural, or what are we looking at? Like, to understand how to fix it, we got to understand the problem, right?
No, I think it is. I think that centralization of power is a huge part of why it's so corrupted. I mean, it's not the structure of the internet, because the structure of the internet fundamentally is decentralized, as you know. Yeah, I mean, it's my personal and political beliefs that, like, you can't have power at that concentration without it corrupting. The impetus for growth to just keep pursuing more and more. I mean, like, Facebook's model of basically like global domination, had they been thinking about how that would work as a decentralized project. I mean, there are many things that are compelling to me about the idea of decentralization, technically and on a human level. The human side of it is like, if you have a company that like provides a service that's something like Facebook, and you don't concentrate power and wealth and status in a few people, are you going to end up in a situation where they're behaving so unethically? Because if you decentralize it, then you're accountable to so many more people, and you just don't even have, you wouldn't even have the ability to to do something at that scale. I mean, maybe it's naive, right? Because we haven't seen that play out. Like, we don't have a project where we can compare, but it just seems to me like, the fundamental issues here are that, Sheryl Sandberg and Mark Zuckerberg have designs on global power. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg, I actually think, is kind of an idiot. And I'm not giving him a pass, but I think I don't know what he's motivated by. Sheryl Sandberg is a real political actor, though, and so I think that she has a political vision about taking power, that if Facebook were a decentralized project, there would be no possibility for her to do that. So. Yeah, but it's an interesting thought experiment. I would love to see a project even, come close, so that we can test out if that's true, or if humans are just irredeemable and we have no hope.
Well, hopefully we do find out. So this is a good transition into something I do want to get into a little bit more deeply, which is the relationship between technologies, like new technologies, and decentralization. And I think a good place to start there is talking about some ways in which Tor itself is decentralized and how that helps it in its mission.
Yeah, so the whole design of Tor is basically is to be as decentralized as possible. One of the design components where you see that the most is in the relay system. So basically, this is how Tor works. So let's say that you are a Tor user, you open up Tor browser. So you've got the Tor client open in front of you, and you're going on your websites, and nobody knows where in the world you are. The way that is able to happen is because when you connect to Tor, what you're actually doing is you're getting assigned a randomly assigned circuit of 3 relays for every website that you visit. These relays are just computers that are configured to forward traffic. That's all they do. And each one of them, and so the circuit, will forward traffic from the first relay to the second relay, and finally to the exit relay. And that's the one that takes you to your destination website. each of those relays only has the information that it needs to proceed to the next step.
Mhm.
And so the first relay knows who you are. It knows who the second relay is, but it doesn't know the exit relay and it doesn't know the destination website. And it each relay works the same way. The second one knows the first, it knows the third, it doesn't know you, and it doesn't know your destination. So each one, they work together in a system to protect an adversary from correlating like you to the website you're visiting. So these relays are part of the fundamental decentralized design of the Tor network because they're run by volunteers all over the world. There are, gosh, I don't know how many relays in the network now. I think it's around 7,000. And basically, we have a bunch of different safeguards in place to make sure that one person or entity is not controlling too many of those relays, because then we would have to basically distrust them because they would control too much of the network. And so that is really fundamental to how we make Tor.
That's so fascinating. And I think a lot of people who don't know how Tor works are probably going to go and try to dig this up now. And I guess the hope would be that they run their own relayers, right? Like, how can people get involved with the Tor project?
Absolutely. We always need more relays, especially people who, I mean, if you are interested in decentralization, especially as a technical concept, like I think to me, it's one of the most interesting ways that that is playing out at a scale. More relays mean that the network will be more stable. It'll be faster. It's just like a total, like, I mean, it helps us so much when people run relays. If people don't have the technical capacity to run relays, that's fine. We're actually running our donation campaign right now. So you can go to donate.torproject.org, and that will help, keep up this like, amazing decentralized project. And then also you can do both. You can run a relay and you can donate too if you want.
Yeah, nobody should feel like they're prohibited from doing both because they've done the other.
Absolutely.
No, it makes a lot of sense. Now, what I want to talk with you about, though, is not necessarily just the ways in which Tor is decentralized, but a lot of the other guests we've had on this podcast. And at this point in time, you're a pretty unique guest, although that's not the intent going forward. Most of them are coming from projects that are in the blockchain space specifically. And the promise of blockchain was that it was going to be this decentralized technology. In the context of Bitcoin, it was going to enable a decentralized financial system that wasn't beholden to governments or banks and all of these other things. It may have gotten off track a little bit in the last couple of years. And if you've been keeping track, there's a number of reasons for that. And like any technology or like any organization, it's not immune to the pressure of egos and regulation and all these other things. And I think what gets lost a lot of the time now is some of the core principles that were behind some of the decentralization movement originally. And a lot of people who have come into the space are just really not familiar with a lot of decentralized technologies if they don't involve a blockchain, which is really weird for me to think about and probably for you. But a lot of people listening to this think blockchain is decentralized and might not understand how like Tor or even something like torrents work. What's your take? And feel free to be as diplomatic or non-diplomatic as you like. But what is your take on like blockchain right now? Just the word.
I mean, the word at this point, I think, is pretty cringy. I mean, I think that you're right that like it's become something like if there was a meaningful like kind of vision behind it that had to do with like how people wanted technology to function and who they wanted to be beholden to. I mean, to me, it seems like that is gone. I mean, at least for the time being, and I'm also like an outsider in this because I've never been involved in the blockchain community. So, if I'm wrong that there are like a bunch of people like really like vehemently stuck to the original idea, then I apologize to those people. But I think, I mean, from my point of view as somebody working as like a full-time internet activist and paying attention in this space, it seems like most of the people who are like enthusiastic about blockchain now are just trying to make money. And I don't see the anything that's like, motivating kind of political vision I just don't, I don't see it.
Well, here's where we get back to your thing about just people, right? Like, it's never just people. And there's definitely individuals who share that vision, and some of them are caught up in different parts of the space, or some of them are even trying to implement blockchain or other decentralized technologies, let's say in their traditional organizations. Like, they're trying to have some kind of internal blockchain team at a bank. And, maybe they share this vision and like they work at a bank. So there's really just no way for them to really pursue it in the way that you or I might hope they would, which is, outside the context of just pure bottom line profits. I'm wondering, like, if people in this space really did have that mission and vision in mind, but all they knew was blockchain projects, how can we get them thinking more about the projects that have come before them that really do have that mission and vision, that aren't as motivated by profit? Like, to me, a lot of it has to do with storytelling, right? And I don't know if you think a lot about how to reach these people, but I can guarantee you, as somebody who does work within that space, that they're there. They're just not evenly distributed, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right about storytelling. I mean, it's certainly something that we do in Tor. We try to, talk about who Tor users are and what their lives are like and why they use Tor as a way not just to like give a human face to the many millions of people who use Tor, but also to encourage people to work on the project because they care about other humans and they want those humans to have a safe way to access the internet. So in terms of like getting some of the ideological blockchain types to care about other like decentralized projects, I mean, it's a good question. I haven't really thought about that, honestly. I mean, what comes to mind immediately is like what I would want to know is like, are they feeling disillusioned because they care about this from a political point of view and like they're not getting that anymore, or the space has been taken over by like all these like like Bitcoin bros or whatever? Because if that's how they feel, then like I think like there's so much to like the kind of broader free software community, which is for the most part, I think also shares the values of like decentralization or whatever, that puts their politics forward, that like makes it clear that they're doing this because they want internet infrastructure that is collectively owned and worked on and that is transparent and that puts user privacy first and puts human rights first and all these things. But the discoverability part, I think, is the challenging thing because these are kind of niche communities. I don't want to say niche. I mean, they're big. They're really big. I mean, especially like Latin America, free software is huge. But it's the sort of thing like you kind of don't find it until you're looking for it sometimes,
No, you're absolutely right. It is a challenge. People get very caught up in the thing that they know and that they've seen, and it's also a very young space. A lot of people who are in the blockchain space are people who have owned like a Bitcoin but have never owned a stock. You're talking, so it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity in that these people don't come in with a bunch of preconceived notions about how the world should be organized or what should come first, principles or profit. And I think that that's really exciting. But I want to ask you something else here, which is, I think part of the problem is that a lot of the people who have come into the decentralization space in the last few years from the context of blockchain put blockchain at the center. They're really determined to find a way to make a blockchain useful. They really like blockchains. And then they expand and it's like, okay, but you keep asking why. Is a blockchain in service of decentralization? Sure. So maybe decentralization is what you care about, not blockchain. Well, but why do you care about decentralization? Maybe you care about decentralization because you're passionate about privacy, or you're passionate about distributing power fairly and having sustainable systems. I mean, there's just so many ways that you can get back to principles, but it doesn't always happen, right? You don't always get back to principles if you get too caught up in the tech. How do we get the conversation, about all of this? Because I think Tor has this problem problem as well. How do we get the conversation to be back around principles and not so much the specifics of the technology or how it might be misused, let's say?
Well, in Tor, that's basically like making it about our principles and why we make Tor is at the forefront of everything we do. I mean, especially in the last few years, we're really a mission-driven nonprofit organization, and so I think that you see that reflected in all of our work. I mean, the technology can't it doesn't exist without the mission. So for us, like we're our mission is about like giving people in the world access to technology that respects their human rights. I'm paraphrasing our mission because I don't have it memorized, but there's all those words are in there, right? um we're just thinking constantly about what that means in practice. And so some of what it means is like we need to make sure that the network is like robust and safe for people to use. So the decentralization part comes into that. We want many different kinds of users and many different kinds of operators and people contributing code and other kinds of documentation and other contributions. And that's another kind of way to think about the decentralization thing, because if we only have like white boy hackers from Western Europe and the US and Canada, that's not a decentralized project,
Right.
because that is concentrating a specific kind of power in specific places. And it's only one set, a very, very narrow set of experiences. And so we're not going to be able to make Tor work for everybody. So, yeah, I mean, we achieve this by being a mission driven organization in terms of, doing that for others. I mean, the blockchain problem that you identify is really hard, I think, because you're talking about people who've come into the space, a lot of people, because they like heard about this like flashy new thing that can make them a bunch of money, and to get to the principles part of it is, I think, way harder from there. For us, it's like we put it at the, it's like at the heading of everything.
Oh, yeah, it's on your front page. It's in your mission statement.
Yeah.
Like I know that it's
Yeah.
central to everything, and I know I can't remember the last blockchain project where the first thing I did was land on the front page, and it kind of laid out the same sort of stuff, right? That's just not how they operate. But I do think it's a dangerous assumption to say that I don't think it's as big of a process of radicalization as you're making it sound to have somebody who supports one of these projects suddenly become somebody who cares deeply about the mission and values. I almost think that's something that you can sort of Trojan horse into people, especially because these missions and values are so resonant. Like maybe they didn't understand that they cared, but you can make them see that they did. I think this is so fundamentally human that it's not a question of kind of tricking people into believing it. It's just you have to sort of point them inward at the right moment with in the right with enough silence, I suppose, for introspection, where they can see maybe I accidentally did care about the mission and values all along. Maybe blockchain was just the thing that opened the door.
Yeah, maybe. And, I guess it like reflects my like ignorance and assumptions about who these people are and what they're doing. And so, I
look,
trust
until they
your,
put it on their homepage, I don't know that you're wrong.
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, so maybe I'm like, asking for like people to put their money where their mouth is or whatever, because that is what you look like to the world if you're not doing that.
I think that's really valuable feedback coming into the ecosystem from somebody who's, tangential, but obviously not intimately involved with the day-to-day of like whatever the blockchain space is today, right? But I want to ask you about now the Library Freedom Project, because this is something else that you're very passionate about, that you founded, and I want to know what it is, why you created it, what your role in it is now, how it relates to everything else we've been talking about.
Library Freedom Project is a very tiny organization that I started to teach librarians about ways to bring privacy back into libraries and in their local communities. The reason I focus on librarians is because they have both ethical commitments to privacy because they understand like how necessary it is for things like intellectual freedom, and also because they have a relationship to the public that is without parallel. You can go into a library in most communities, and you don't have to do anything, you don't have to buy anything. You're not thought of as a consumer or even as a citizen. It doesn't matter if you pay taxes there,
Hmm.
what your status is, in terms of immigration or whatever. You get to just go there and be there. Also, libraries provide some of the only free computer classes in most communities. And so I saw an opportunity to teach librarians about privacy tools and strategies and the kind of like overarching privacy problem, because they're in a really good position where they can teach other people about it, so they can make changes on their computers there, they can teach classes, they can advocate for better privacy protections locally and nationally. So they're a really good audience for all this.
They're what I like to call, and I know you're saying it's a tiny organization, but I still think it's a very impactful organization potentially, because you're targeting what I'm calling like a high leverage individual in society, the librarian, and I think there's all kinds of high leverage groups like that are not necessarily big groups, and they don't necessarily run Facebook, but they are extremely valuable and they are integrated into their local communities in the ways that you're saying. Do you think that there's other kinds of like high leverage groups that we should be targeting to help educate them about these issues of privacy, or maybe, how decentralized technologies can contribute to protecting privacy and protecting human rights?
It's a good question. I think that there are. I mean, like when I think about other people who have the kind of similar role, you know, maybe like teachers or maybe like social workers. But honestly, I mean, I think that like anybody who is in not even the public sector alone. Let me just like work through this thought a little bit. Basically, my feeling is that we're bombarded by so much advertising, so much that is trying to convince us of the like dominant position about sharing our data with private companies. So, um, advertising and a great deal of media, that anything that can be um, uh, any like away from keyboard AFK entities that can like provide a kind of reality check on that is good. Whether with some of them, I think would be harder than others, but like I don't see any limit to what the possibilities are there. So like for example, we can like if we get healthcare providers to start prioritizing privacy and like understanding what HIPAA actually is and the
Mm,
limitations to it, and how their like out of date Windows XP computers in the hospital are actually like very unsafe for all these reasons, and using this third party software to like keep patient data is also unsafe for all these reasons. If we build like competencies among um, all different kinds of service providers, then we can actually counter this multi-billion-dollar industry that's trying to convince us otherwise. You feel me? Is this like making sense? It's like it's like a thought that it's not
No, we're
fully
working through this
developed.
thought together, right?
Yeah.
Like we're taking on the role of educators in this space, right? And we're saying that we need to help teach the world. Like obviously neither of us is saying like that only a few people deserve to be taught about this stuff. Obviously we're saying that this should be kind of universal understanding, and we should be democratizing access to technologies and materials that help people understand the importance of privacy but also protect their own privacy. And we're just trying to identify like leverage points, because it's all about like if you can start by targeting the right people, maybe this stuff spreads faster. And maybe if you're focusing too much on the wrong people, you hit these sticking points, right? There's only so much time in the day. There's only so many resources we have. And as you said, we're competing with an awful lot of noise from an awful lot of people who, again, maybe not consciously, but they're amplifying these messages around, what's important. we're saying it's privacy and, individual rights. And they're saying it's a profit motive, or they're saying it's, their own individual employment. And it's just a question of like balancing the conversation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard for us to even come close to what looks like a balance when we're up against like the most powerful companies in the world. But I think that real life, like meaningful, real life relationships have a lot of meaning, and like, and trust is, something that like has an incredible amount of value. And so, if we are making privacy a priority in all these spaces that like already have a great deal of trust, like it can build even more. And it's the only way that we can meaningfully counter these very powerful industries that want all of our data.
So who else is working on this stuff? I know Tor is taking a very, they're prioritizing a technical approach to this stuff, right? Like technologies that help people protect their own privacy. And Enigma is the same way. But there's a lot of organizations that don't necessarily build technical solutions, right? They're advocates or they're activists. They do lobbying, essentially. They're trying to make sure at least lawmakers can understand the ramifications that their laws have on individual privacy. They may genuinely, for at least from what I've seen from lawmakers, a lot of them genuinely don't understand what they're doing. So it's understandable that they might not understand the consequences of their action. So who are some other organizations that you think are doing really good work in that regard?
Well, there's the big ones like the Electronic Frontier Foundation. They work on policy. They sue the government for violating our rights. They make technology. They do all kinds of stuff. Then there are some organizations that their mandate is a little bit more broad than just like thinking about the privacy problem, but when they are thinking about privacy and surveillance, they do it really well. So like the ACLU is one. There are some international, EFF is international. I should have mentioned that. Some other international organizations that are really good. Privacy International does a lot of great policy work based in Europe. There's some more kind of like advocacy, activisty type groups like Tactical Technology Collective. They teach people about protecting their privacy. They put a lot of great resources out to this end. Who else comes to mind? There's no more in my brain. I'm so sorry.
Well, it's already like good to know that so many organizations have been working on this for so long, right? This is a fight that's gone on at least since the dawn of, I guess what I would call like the modern era of the internet. As soon as these values kind of came under threat, there were already people trying to speak on behalf of the individual. And that work is ongoing, and it's definitely something that I try to follow, and I find it to be really admirable and really tough. So as means of wrapping up, if there's anything else that somebody listening to this would want to do, if they got inspired by hearing you talk about this stuff and they wanted to just learn more about your work or anything else, like, is there anything else that they can do right away or go somewhere they can go to learn more?
Well, they can go to Tor Project's website, which is torproject.org. I recommend looking at our blog to see what we've been up to recently. We make new posts constantly, like several per week. And then the Library Freedom Project's website is just libraryfreedomproject.org, and you can see what we're doing there.
Awesome. I'm going to add all of these links to the podcast description, and people can definitely feel free to follow up with all these organizations and all these awesome projects at your leisure. But Alison, thank you so much for appearing today. I really appreciate the conversation. I think that you've got a really valuable perspective on all of this stuff, and a lot of our audience, it might be new to them. And so hopefully you've got some new converts at the end of this.
Thanks. It was great talking to you.